Chapter 5, Aloneness. I camped alone for the better part of a month. Grandfather had gone deep into the southern part of the Pine Barrens to visit an old Native American friend, and Rick was away with his family for most of the summer. Certainly I'd camped many times alone before, but this was the longest I'd gone without seeing another person. For about the first week, it was so good to be alone. I had no one to please but myself, and I could practice my skills endlessly without having to discuss what should be practiced with Rick. There is also that timelessness that occurs when one is alone. I was governed now by my own internal clock. Time becomes only necessary when other people are involved. So, too, was there a profound freedom that comes with the aloneness, a freedom to do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. However, after the novelty of the first 2 weeks of being alone wore off, I began to feel very lonely. I had accomplished and witnessed so many things that I wanted to share them with someone, but there was no one there. At first, the feeling of loneliness only hit me around the fire at nightfall, a time when we would normally share things with each other. Then, as the days passed, the pangs of loneliness would become more frequent, especially in the quiet hours. After dark, the loneliness became acute. I found myself doing things just to keep my mind off my loneliness and on other things. The skills I began to practice became more involved, requiring more concentration or physical performance. So too did I find myself talking to myself out loud just to hear a human voice. Now going well into my 3rd week alone, I began to feel a prisoner of this aloneness. I thought frequently about going out of the woods and heading back home for a while. I even considered going to one of the closer houses just to watch people for a while. My conversations with myself were becoming rather lengthy and complicated. I even began to answer myself, frequently thinking out loud. After a while, all I could think about was how alone and abandoned I felt. The loneliness saturated my every mood to a point where I could think of nothing else at all. I so desperately wanted to share so much of what I had done over the past several weeks with someone, anyone. At this point, I began to doubt myself. I thought that if I were ever to understand what Grandfather did, I would have to love to be alone. Right then, I hated it with a passion. Grandfather so often told me how important extended periods of aloneness would become to my development, not only in survival, but especially in the things of the spirit. Aloneness and asceticism were part of a person's spiritual teachings, and without that, one could only understand part of the truth. This really bothered me, for I thought that somehow the woods and the world of spirit were trying to drive me away. They seemed to be somehow using my isolation and loneliness as a weeding device. It was like some kind of test that I had to pass. I knew that this should be an easy and much welcome process, but the aloneness and isolation became profound loneliness. I became so disgusted with myself for feeling this way. I felt unworthy, for loneliness did not seem to be part of Grandfather's consciousness. Finally, on the first day of the 4th week, I decided that I could take no more and began to pack up my camp. I would just go home for a few days and then come back to the woods after I'd gotten enough company. Just as I put all my things in my cache, I looked up with a start. Grandfather was sitting at the edge of camp watching me. At first I felt overjoyed to see him and wanted to run right over to him, but this feeling was soon supplanted by the feeling of guilt. Grandfather knew that I was to be alone for at least 4 weeks. In fact, he had advised it, but now I was leaving early and felt very embarrassed for giving in. He kept watching me with a half-smile on his face, though there was no accusation or disappointment to be found in his eyes. He said nothing, but just motioned me over to sit down. I approached him humbly, feeling that in some way I had disgraced him and myself. Without waiting for me to ask a question, he said, "I was expecting it would be about this time when you would leave. I knew that the loneliness would eventually try to drive you from the woods." I was shocked by his statement, not only because he had known the time I would be driven from the woods, but also by what would drive me from the woods. I told him then that I felt like I had dishonored him in some way, but I just couldn't take being alone anymore. I felt that the loneliness was getting in the way of everything else, and because of the loneliness, I did not feel myself worthy of a spiritual path. He then said, "There is a vast expanse between being alone and loneliness, and you must find the difference. We all must face that question someday, and yours is now." With those words, he began to tell me the story of his aloneness. Grandfather said that he had been wandering for quite a few years when he hit the tremendous barrier of loneliness. Certainly he missed his people, but he had traveled back to their encampment several times over those early years. He also encountered many people in his journeys, so his aloneness was not always that prolonged. However, there was a period in his life when he faced true loneliness for nearly 10 years. It was during those years that he did not speak to or see another human. He was just too deep in the trackless wilderness of Canada, where few, if any, people ever ventured. In fact, during that time, he rarely even found a track or any other evidence of another human. It was then, in the beginning of this long period of asceticism, that he would have to face the demon of loneliness. Grandfather said that the loneliness and oppressive isolation did not hit him all at once. Instead, it was a gradual process that overtook him slowly. At first he found that many of his questions were going unanswered. He yearned for the elders, needing their advice many times, but he knew that there would be no way he could get to them. His feelings of being isolated and abandoned were especially intense at night, but soon they even intensified during the day. It was not so much that he missed people in general, for he had always avoided people outside his own tribe. He just missed his family and tribe. Though, after a while, he began to long for anyone to come along, even if they were in the wilderness for the wrong reasons. The need to talk to someone became a driving passion that saturated his every waking hour. Even with the passage of time and season, the feelings of intense loneliness never weakened. On the contrary, they grew stronger. There was never a period of relief, not even for a moment. No matter what Grandfather did, he could not shake that horrible longing. Several times he purposely moved camp, for no other reason than the change of scenery might take away the sting of isolation, but this was to no avail. So too did he practice skills and disciplines that would involve full concentration of thought and action, but here too he found no comfort. It came to a point where he could not think or function at all without the horrible feeling of loneliness overtaking him altogether and overshadowing everything else. He knew all along that someday he would have to face that intense loneliness, and that is what kept him going, even in the deepest moments of despair. In desperation, Grandfather began to look to nature and spirit for comfort. Even there, the communications were weak and after a while became obscure altogether. The piercing loneliness overshadowed everything and even excluded any spiritual conversation or understanding. Grandfather knew very well that he would have to transcend this loneliness or it would forever become his demon. It would defeat him unless he understood and finally defeated its smothering power. Aloneness was a vital part of any spiritual path, and he had to separate aloneness from being lonely, but he had no idea as to where to begin his search for answers. What had kept him going for so long was his sheer determination, but even that was beginning to erode. It was at this point, after many seasons of being absolutely alone, that he decided to travel out of the Canadian wilderness and back to his people, or at least to areas where he could find some old ones living alone. As he slowly packed up his camp, he began to argue with himself about giving in to the loneliness. He argued that he needed to see someone, anyone, because his isolation was affecting his every mood and action. On the other hand, he knew how important it was to be alone, especially for those on a spiritual path. He knew that if not at this point in his life, then he would have to face the demon of loneliness eventually. He lingered for several more days in his camp area, even though he had pulled everything down and scattered it to the earth. Internal struggle to go or stay became overwhelming. Finally, in a sheer act of desperation, he decided that he would leave the area and go back to his people. He headed south, a direction that he assumed would bring him out of this wilderness quickly rather than to retrace his journey to the southwest. What he did not realize was that his route would bring him deeper into the wilderness and into the high mountain areas, many of which had no passes leading out. He wandered into the mountains for days before he realized that he was walking deeper into the wilderness. The surrounding peaks had already been covered by the first snowfall of the season, and Grandfather knew that unless he found some mountain pass, he would be trapped here for the winter. It was far too late for him to backtrack now, so all he could do was to search out an accessible pass. Days slipped by as he repeatedly tried and failed to find a mountain pass. The trails he had chosen thus far were too high and slippery to afford safe passage. So too did the pre-winter storms batter the higher peaks frequently, and at times he found himself wading through waist-deep snow. Finally resolving himself to the fact that none of the trails he had taken would lead him anywhere, he moved back down into a small, deep valley where he built a temporary camp. What became foremost on his mind, once the necessities of camp were taken care of, was to build a set of snowshoes. He had only one hope of getting out, and that was to make the snowshoes so that he could get through the high mountain snows. This was his last hope for getting out before the full fury of winter hit. He worked feverishly at the snowshoes for several days. Proper materials were now a little more difficult to come by. He also had to build a larger pair than he normally would have, with a tighter weave. Such were the deep powder conditions of the higher snows. Finally, after 3 days, the snowshoes were completed, and he had stored up enough food to last him well into his journey. Before dawn on the 4th day, he struck out again to the mountains. Out of all the passes he had tried, he knew that there was one that would hold the most hope. Though it had a bad exposure to any oncoming storm, if the weather held, he could stand the best chance. It seemed to be the easiest climb, and most of the deeper snow had been swept away from the rock faces by the strong winds of the previous days. With prayers on his lips and hope in his heart, he left camp and headed directly to the pass. It took him nearly half a day to arrive at the base of the mountain pass. Without hesitation, he decided to build a camp and spend the night. Even when he struck out the next day, the camp would be left standing in case he could not make it back through the pass and was forced to retreat. At least then he would have a safe refuge to recuperate from his attempt. He also decided that attempting this pass so late in the day, he might be forced to spend the night on the barren, exposed rocks high above. That would afford little protection and no way of building a shelter, as the rock faces were high above timberline. Even if the conditions were absolutely perfect, it would be a difficult and treacherous climb, a climb that would easily demand much of the day. He also had no idea of what he faced on the other side. He could only guess that it led down. In the place where he decided to put his camp, there was already light snow on the ground from previous storms. He was much higher up in the mountains than he had been in the last camp, and a good snowstorm would very likely dump heavy amounts on the area. He took a great deal of time to build the shelter solid and strong, designing it to withstand heavy snows on the roof. He also spent the latter part of the day gathering up firewood and making sure his hand drill worked without fail. These he would leave inside the shelter to assure that they remained dry. So, too, did he gather nuts, roots, and some of the last remaining berries in the area, again storing them deep in his shelter. Food would be impossible to obtain during any sort of mountain blizzard. That night he went into the shelter early in the hopes of getting a good night's sleep. Unfortunately, his sleep was racked with hideous nightmares of slipping and falling from the high rocks. Several times he awoke in a cold sweat, feeling that he was in the process of falling. He dreamed of snows and blizzard conditions, of avalanches burying him, and huge chunks of rock and ice falling from the mountain peaks. His final awakening was to the sound of a thundering rock slide. He dreamed that he had fallen and started the slide that threatened to bury and crush him. He awoke with a sense of terror to a point where he uncontrollably shook all over. The whole scenario of dreams shook him up so badly that he was reluctant to leave camp at first. He gazed up the icy peaks toward the pass for a long time, watching the first glimmers of daylight begin to light the highest spires. Now, with his confidence building and what appeared to be the start of a beautiful day, he struck out from camp and headed to the pass. At first, the trek was quite easy. He followed animal trails up to the base of the steeper elevations. The animal trails switched back and forth across the face of the lower mountain, making it an easy walk. However, as Grandfather reached the midpoint, the trails steepened and the snows grew deeper. Eventually, he had to put on his snowshoes before he could continue any higher. From past experience, if the snow got deeper than the knee, he would be using far too much energy. He had to conserve energy if he was to ever make it through the pass. Grandfather quickly strapped on his snowshoes and proceeded without delay. The deep snows and the steeper conditions made his progress slow, even with the snowshoes. At times he had to crawl, and at other times he had to use sticks to help him keep his footing. Finally, by high noon, he was past the upper tree line and now was facing open slopes. Eventually he reached the barren rocks that had been cleaned by the winds, and he could take off his snowshoes and begin to move more quickly. His progress was slowed rather abruptly again when he found that much of the upper exposed rocks were covered in sheer ice. He had to fashion rock spikes and use these as traversing spikes to keep him from slipping off the slope and over the cliff. Several times the rock spikes broke or did not hold at all, sending him sliding down several terrifying feet. Grandfather had to pour all of his consciousness into what he was doing. He could not take his mind off the icy slopes, not even for a moment. Each rock spike had to be chipped solidly into the ice, and each foot had to be put into a position that would not slip. One wrong move, one slight shift of weight, and he would be carried down the slope and over the cliff to his death. With all of his concentration poured into what he was doing, he did not notice how long it was taking him to traverse the upper slope. At the rate he was going, he would not even make it to the top of the pass by nightfall and would be forced to spend the entire night in full exposure to the elements. Nor did he notice the approach of an oncoming storm, which would certainly catch him on the icy slopes if he did not pick up his speed. His concentration was so absolute that he had no other sensation than himself, the rock, and the ice. Finally, Grandfather reached a point on the slope where he could rest. There was a small indent into the side of the slope that was caused from the dislodging of a large boulder in a past season. It appeared to be much like a huge bird's nest or bowl cut deep into the slope. It would afford him some flat ground, a partial buffer to the wind, and a much-needed resting place. Once Grandfather was inside the boulder bowl, and his concentration removed from the rock face, he began to view his surroundings. He immediately realized that he would never make it to the higher area before full dark, nor could he make a full retreat before full dark. He had two choices: proceed up the slope, climbing in the dark, or spend the night in the boulder bowl. It was then that he also noticed the oncoming storm. Grandfather was terrified. Panic began to set in, for he realized that any choice he made could mean his death. If he stayed in the rock bowl for the night, he might survive, but with the oncoming storm, it seemed highly unlikely. If he tried to climb across the face to the higher pass, he would face climbing in the dark, a climb that was treacherous enough in full daylight. Even then, when he eventually hit the pass, he would have to weather out the oncoming storm in full exposure. The storm looked to him as if it contained an awesome power. He could already see distant peaks being obscured by driving snow, and the winds were now steadily increasing. His only hope was to try to go back down to his camp and hopefully beat the storm in the fast disappearing light. He knew that the climb down would be more perilous and difficult than the climb up, but that was the only choice he had. At least he would be part of the way down the slope when he was reached by full dark or the storm. Without fully resting, he refashioned his rock spikes and began the long journey back down. He went much slower than he had before, caused more by taking his time than by what the rock face dictated. He began to slip more frequently, and placement of his feet was far more difficult. Such was his reverse angle of descent. At one point along the journey, his stone spikes gave way, and he slid several yards down the rock face and dangerously close to the cliff. The only way he could continue with the climb was to go straight back to the rock bowl and begin over again. It was fast approaching dusk, and the winds were howling across the rock face as Grandfather finally reached the rock bowl. Again, without much of a rest, he climbed out again. He had not gone more than a few yards when he realized that he would not be able to make it back to his camp. The winds had increased so much that they threatened to tear him from the rock face. He now had only one choice, and that was to spend the night back in the rock bowl. By the time he got back to the bowl, it was full dark. The winds were raging, and now it was beginning to snow hard. Fortunately, the storm was hitting the rock bowl at a slight angle, and this gave Grandfather protection from the full onslaught of the storm. Grandfather prayed feverishly as he listened to the winds and looked out into the darkness. He was trapped, and without a good shelter, he knew that the chance of his survival was minimal. The rage of the storm increased as the hours passed. Eventually, Grandfather became entombed by snow in the rock bowl. At this point, he was now totally out of the wind, and the insulation of the snow kept him from freezing. The hours passed miserably, but at least he was alive. He could hear the screaming winds even through the muffling snows, and there was no let-up in their intensity. He packed the snow around him to create a small room. Several times he had to punch his arm through the snow cover to let in fresh air. Each time he had to reach further and further out as the snow's depth increased. At least now, when there was a break in the weather, it would become easier to traverse the slope and head back to his camp. The snow would surely accumulate on the slope and cover the treacherous ice. Using his snowshoes, he knew that he would at least stand a better chance and not slip as he had before. Finally, As he punched through the snow, he could see the faint glimmer of daylight coming through the air hole, now several feet above him. Though the storm still raged outside, he knew that he could not stay in the small snow cave much longer. His energy was depleted, and he had begun to shiver intermittently through the night. Freezing to death would not be far away, and he would have to move as soon as possible. He punched his way through the wall of his little snow cave and into the stormy daylight. The landscape had been transformed, and deep snow now clung to the slopes, completely covering the ice. As he gazed out into the barren landscape, he saw no break in the storm, and without hesitation he put on his snowshoes and carefully left the snow cave. Very cautiously and slowly he began to work his way across the snowy slope. Now, with the aid of the snowshoes on the deep snow, he could almost walk upright, so unlike the belly-down crawl of the day before. For a moment it passed through his mind that he should try now to make it to the pass, but the storm's fury put it forever out of the question. Instead, he continued relentlessly, concentrating on every move, the feel of the snow and the lay of the slope. In several of the deeper areas, he saw that he was climbing directly beneath an avalanche and had to use even more care in his foot placement. One small avalanche gave in behind him and narrowly missed wiping him off the face of the mountain. The cold also bit deep into his flesh to a point where he could barely feel his hands and feet. It now took all of his concentration just to keep going on. He began to draw on a strength he did not know he had. His body and mind felt so in tune with the mountain and snow to a point where movement became almost effortless. Soon the power of the storm was forgotten as he began to make greater progress. He could feel his body living on the edge of life and death, traveling as gracefully as a well-conditioned animal. He loved that feeling, for he became totally focused on its power and motion. It became a dance more fluid than he had ever known. At this point, he no longer felt the cold and began to sweat, even though the storm kept up its raging intensity. He felt so proud of himself, for the years of training had truly snatched him from the perilous edge of death. It was not long before Grandfather reached his camp. In a short period of time, he had dug out his shelter and had a warm fire going inside. He cooked and ate some of his food, then melted snow for drinking water. He could feel his full strength returning as he fell into a state of deep peace. He felt so alive and whole that he began to laugh and cry at the same time. Something on that mountain had profoundly moved something inside of him, but he did not know what it was. All he knew was that something had changed, and he liked the feeling. He had not felt this much peace and serenity in a very long time. He reveled in the moment to a point where he felt like he was going to burst with uncontrollable joy. He had gained a passion for living like he'd never known. It wasn't long before Grandfather fell into a deep and much-needed sleep. Grandfather awoke the next morning to a beautiful day. The sun shone down bright and the air was pure and still. He could feel the warmth of the sun and could go about his morning chores without his robe. The feeling of elation that he had had the day before made his day even brighter, and he sang as he worked. He still could not understand what had shifted inside of him, or even how it had gotten there. He wondered if it had been the fact that he had been so close to the edge of death, but had beaten it back and robbed it of its triumph. Many times after walking the edge of life and death, Grandfather would experience a similar elation, but this was not quite the same. This was something far different than one gets from the high achievement when triumphing over impossible odds, but he could not yet understand. As Grandfather sat down to take in all the beauty that surrounded him, the answer suddenly came to him. He was not lonely anymore. He still did not know why it had happened, but the change in him was transcending the loneliness that had haunted him for so many months. In fact, he had not been lonely since he decided to make the climb to the pass. He began to wonder if the loneliness was yet to come back. Certainly his full attention was on his treacherous trek, and there had been no room for loneliness, or for that matter, anything else. His concentration had been so absolute that there could be room for nothing else. But he somehow knew that the loneliness would not return, or at least not as it had before. There was too much peace within him, and he enjoyed the solitude. There was not even a longing to go back to his people, as had been before, even though he would like to see them. He didn't need to see them. He began to think deeply about the change in himself and why it might have happened. It was then when he remembered what great-grandfather Coyote Thunder had told him about being alone and loneliness. He had said, "The chasm between being alone and loneliness is deep. The way you begin to be alone and at peace without being lonely is to know that you are with your best friend. When you are at peace with yourself and love yourself, you can never be lonely. Only when one learns to love himself can he love another. You must find that love for yourself before you can touch the purity of aloneness. Love of self, without being selfish, will not allow loneliness to exist. Love of self also creates a love for everything else and brings us closer to the sacred oneness." Grandfather thought long and hard about Coyote Thunder's words, trying to fit them into what had happened to him on the face of the mountain. As Grandfather retraced all the events of the past several days, it finally occurred to him what had happened to change the loneliness into aloneness. It was at the point when he was making the journey back to the camp that he began to appreciate what his body could do. In that appreciation, he also found a love for himself. It was at this point when he stopped being critical of his every thought and action and began to accept himself, value himself as he would everyone and everything else. That is when his journey became an effortless dance and he felt so much part of the mountain and the snow. This is when the loneliness vanished forever. Grandfather's story of aloneness helped me through the next several weeks, though I cannot say there weren't periods of time when I felt lonely, for there were. They were not severe. Nor did the periods of loneliness get to a point where I had wanted to leave the Pine Barrens. I did begin to grow more comfortable with my aloneness because I began to like being with myself. I stopped being so critical of actions and began to enjoy my mistakes and failures. As Grandfather had said, you can't be lonely when you are with your best friend, yourself. So too did I learn that spiritually one can never be alone. We are all connected to all other entities of the earth through the spirit that moves through all things. And once realized that spirit, we become one with all things. There can then be no loneliness.